All right. So we've got two talks tonight, and I appreciate those of you that have made it amidst all the chaos in the elections. I'm sure taking time away from you, glued to the TV and stuff, as I know I am. So appreciate everybody that's attended. So tonight, I know we've got two awesome talks. We've got Devin, who's going to be speaking about caching with PHP. We've also got Justin Yost, who's going to be speaking about Laravel 7 and 8, the new features in that, something I requested. So is one of you wanting to go first, or?
I honestly don't have a preference.
Yeah, I can go first, if that's all right.
Yeah,
Sure.
Cool. So just a couple of shout outs, I guess, before we kick it off. Today we'll be giving away two prizes, the PHP Storm JetBrains license, an awesome sponsor of our user group who's been with us for quite a while. So they have an awesome suite of different IDEs and stuff like that. So stay tuned for that prize, as well as a 1-month subscription to SymphonyCast we'll be giving away as well. So shout out to our awesome anonymous donor who keeps supporting our group and hooking us up with those sorts of things. So still probably not going to be doing in-person meetups for a while. Innovation Center has been pretty dark. I know that they actually, I've heard, canceled all of like the shared space. So really only people with offices are even going there right now. But as soon as that opens up, which I imagine will be next year sometime, things calm down a little bit, we'll resume that. But as of now, this is good because we can at least record them, and definitely check out our YouTube channel for any of our previous meetups. I'll be sure to post this one as well. And also our sponsor Tech Systems. If you are looking for a gig, feel free to check out our meetup page with contact information. Jessica there at Tech Systems is awesome. They have a lot of, she hits me up all the time with different roles that they're looking to fill. So no shortage in the tech space for different, roles out there. So thanks to them as well for sponsoring our meetup. And I think that's about it. So at the end, we'll kind of cover anything new that anybody can think of and figure out other details. But let's go ahead and kick things off to Devin.
Sweet. So I need to figure out how to share on here. I haven't.
Yeah, click the little share your screen button at the bottom left.
The icon. Gotcha. Cool. I'll do this one. Great. You oh, actually that one's not going to work. I apologize. Let me share another screen. There we go. You guys should see a PowerPoint up and running right now. It says caching on it. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thank you very much for that. So thank you, everyone. As Josh said, for coming out today. We are here to talk about caching. Caching to me is a very interesting topic in system design. It's one of those things that will actually, if you can do it right, it'll give you significant performance improvement without having to, do much for the most part. You can get a lot more bang out of your existing hardware for that. So, the overall goal, one of the goals of caching is to improve performance. So, we have one of these, the obligatory, Phil Carlton saying, there's two hard things in computer science, and one of them is caching and validation, and the other thing is naming things. So as I started continue my growth and development and doing more and more, I've seen both of those become true. So now, So your typical system design that we have here, right? We go ahead and one of the things, we are a PHP, and one of the great things about us is, PHP is dynamic, and that's wonderful. Because we're able to easily and readily available bring up these, these sites that have all this content for us. But one of the problems challenge that can come with that is that all of this can come at a cost, and that cost is going to be performance, because on every single request that we have to gather all of the required information, to fulfill and satisfy that request. So, some smart people, after a while, realized that it was very expensive to get the same data repeatedly or perform the same computations repeatedly. So they just sat back down and like, what, let's come up with a better way of doing this. So typically what happens is you have your server, you have your clients, and then you have your server. And from your server, your server is going to be your web application. And then from here, but on a normal, you'll come across and you'll hit your database for your information that you need, whether it's news articles, anything that you need from there. And then that is presented back to the client. So the idea would be the clients would go ahead and still hit the same server, but instead of actually hitting the database, they would hit more of a cache that's going to be a lot more optimized and a lot more performant to satisfy that request. So, your three common use cases to implement a cache is for accessing commonly used data, to avoid computational cycles, and to reduce the database load. So your caches are normally on more like high performant machines, typically with SSDs, whereas databases might be on something a little bit more slower, maybe on hard drives or something of the sort. With the cost of SSDs coming down, we probably have everything on SSDs these days. But still, even with that said, your optimized cache database itself is still going to be more performant than potentially hitting a database. But with all that said, like everything else in programming, this is all about a balancing act. We have to give and take. If our cache becomes too big, so then our cache becomes it becomes too big and it takes too long to actually use the cache, and then it becomes burdensome. And then at that point in time, we might as well not even use the cache and just hit the database directly. So, and then on the flip side is one of the biggest challenges with a cache is to make sure that the data is accurate. And that's the biggest problem with caches, is your data can become stale or outdated. And we're going to talk about how to come up with some solutions about that. Right. So every single cache that we have is going to have some type of storage policy. And that storage policy is going to go ahead and it gives us, we need two information to be able to predict what data that we need to cache. One, when do I need to make the entry cached? And then when do I need it to get evicted? So to answer those, if you can have both of those information or both of those questions answered, then you can make sure that your cache is going to pretty much be always up to date for you. And you don't have to worry about having stale or old data. Now, understanding when you need to make an entry in the cache, that can be challenging, because if you're accessing the cache, you don't know if you need to get it updated or if you actually need to go back to the database. So it's a very fine line for that. And with caching, we don't need to implement caching right away. Caching is one of those performance improvements. So you may say, when do I actually need to go ahead and add caching? And I would recommend, hold off on caching as much as possible, because caching is just going to add a lot more complexity into your application. When you start noticing some of those pains, then we can start implementing some caching and some things like that. Or if you have some very computational, something computational that you have to process, then do that once and then store it in cache. Every single caching solutions has their own types of policies, of writing policies. Now, I'm going to go over the two of them that we have right now, the two common ones, but there are a couple of other policies that are out there. So one of those policies is write through. So when you write through, you are actually, when you're updating the data, and this is the important part, these writing policies are only for when you need to update existing data. So you go ahead and you update the data, you hit the cache, you update that cache, and then you update the database. So with that approach, you always go ahead and your cache is always going to be updated. But one of the challenges that might come with that would be if you have more than one caching solution, your caching might become out of sync. And if your caching system actually, say, crashes before you write to the database, then you'll lose that data. So that's the write through the write through writing policy. And then the write back writing policy is when you need to go ahead and update data inside the database. It hits the cache, deletes the cache, updates the data in the database, and then queries it again. And then on that query gets added inside of the cache. So the biggest issue with this is performance, because you're going to have a lot more entries inside of the cache. However, you're going to have a lot more, your database is going to get hit directly. So if your cache system does fail, not a problem. You can just rebuild the cache from the database itself. So as you can see, it definitely is a balancing act, and you don't have to pick one or the other. You can actually go ahead and have your own hybrid solution where, if you want, you can have write through. If you can go ahead and have your write through, and once your write through has a handful of batch updates it needs to go and do, then it can go ahead and just batch up all of those updates to the database in one fell swoop versus updating each one of those individually. So those are just some of the options that we have for writing policies. And based off of your environment, your needs, and your requirements, obviously you will be able to determine which writing policy makes the most sense for you. Now, placement. Placement is almost more important than actually getting it implemented, because depending on where it's placed is how is the caching solution that you're going to use. So if you have a single application and a single database, then you might want to go ahead and have caching on close to the server per se, where it lives in memory. It does require more memory on that server to actually perform it, because you are performing the web application server, the web application processing on that server, and you're also going to need cache, memory for the cache to perform that. So this is a significantly faster solution when it's as close to the server as possible. It reduces the network load, and it can also reduce the database load. Some challenges with having that cache as close to the server as possible is server failure means loss of the cache. And as long as your database is up to date, then loss of the cache is, for the most part, not so bad. You just need to rewarm that cache up. And with this other solution, the data may go ahead and fall out of sync if there's more than one cache system. So the other option is to have it close to the database, where that close to the database is going to be more or less like a global caching system, where more or less it's going to be kind of like in line of the database from the application. So your application can just hit the cache directly, and then the cache itself will manage to either fetch the data from the database or return the information that we have within our existing cache. So some of the benefits of having it as close to the database as possible is that it's going to be the most accurate information, because we're having that single source of truth for the caching, and it's going to be scalable for us, because all that we need to do is just add another 1 or 2 or 3 or however many we need to that to that global cache cluster itself. So that's wonderful that it can grow build like that. If the actual application server itself crashes, we still have the cache itself. In that global cache, we have less database reads overall, and typically it's a faster database read than Redis. It's a faster database with Redis than it is you're going to have with your typical SQL statement server, SQL statement database servers. and it can withstand an application failure. So overall, this is a little bit slower. This may be slower than the actual closest to the server. It does add a little bit more complexity, but as you can see, once you kind of get to that need to have multiple application systems hitting a global cache system, that complexity kind of just, it goes along with your solution. So I mentioned Redis as a database for a caching system database. There's actually a lot of other types of caching system solutions you can use for a database. You can use file, you can use memory. There's SQLite. You can also use just a database itself, like MySQL or MS SQL or Postgres. And then there's Redis, and then there's Memcache. Redis and Memcache are kind of your go-to that you have for caching, and both Memcache and Redis, they're both key value pair databases. So they're, you have to look them up by the key. So they're the same on that. And then from the research that I've seen, sorry, I'll save that for a moment. Moving on to data types within Redis. So this is a database. The caching system is a database itself. So we do have limitations of the type of data that we can go ahead and put inside of there and how we work within the data. So I've listed a handful of, the 6 common data types that Redis actually does support, from strings, lists, sets, hashes, sorted sets, and bitmaps. So one of the nice things, as I kind of alluded to for, as I alluded to with Memcache and Redis, that the key value pair is that one of the cool things about Redis is that when it's in the cache for Redis, is you can actually go into the cache and update it. Whereas to my understanding, it's a little bit more harder to do that to modify the data directly inside of Memcache. You have to delete the data from Memcache and then re-add it back in, versus where you can modify it directly in Redis, which is pretty cool. So, and then that brings us, so now that we have the architecture, what we need for a caching solution, how we see that might fit within our system. Now we need to talk about what we cache. So from that, there's typically 3 options in here that you normally cache, and that's full page, a object cache, or fragment cache. And essentially a fragment cache is more or less an object cache as well, just part of an object. In the database themselves, they're actually the same for that in the data world. So that is caching in a nutshell. Do you have any? I kind of went a little fast over all that. Do you have any questions? Does anyone?
I've actually never used, or maybe I have and just not been aware, but on the writing policies, I'm curious how that's actually implemented, because I've never had to deal with that before. So that's something new to me. Does like Memcache and Redis kind of have like a default mode for that, or is it just how the way you use it that defines that?
It's the way that you use it, really. To my understanding, I heard about the writing policies prior to doing a deep dive again in for this talk, but I don't have an answer for you on setting that. To my understanding, they're more of theoreticals on how you use it and how you implement it, and then you implement that inside of your own code.
Got it. And then on placement, just more of a note that remember at a previous company, we ended up actually having not only a remote distributed cache, but we ended up installing Memcache on the servers themselves, which allowed us to kind of separate things that needed to be centralized versus things that we could just cache locally to avoid that network round trip. I remember that saving, boosting things quite a bit. So that's important to think about.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, that's a great point. You can definitely mix and match these caching systems and solutions, right, to fit your needs. And there's not going to be one that's going to be perfect for you, but we can definitely add. All of these are just a little piece of the puzzle. And as we put these pieces together, then we get our whole picture. Most definitely. Cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. So I did have a little demo that I was gonna if you guys want to see some caching in action, I can go ahead and show you that. Is that something you're interested in? Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. All right, now you should see. Let me just. Oh. One was. Sorry. One moment, I apologize. So let me go ahead and pull up the code for this one. Sorry, I should have opened this earlier. Good old PHP Storm. All right. So this here is just a more or less of your vanilla PHP. Inside of here, we have a single composer. I found this this page cache GitHub repo inside of here that went ahead and has they already just essentially built out a package for us for caching, and I implemented that. Have it required inside of the vendor loader. We have inside of the actual package itself. We have a configuration file, and then this configuration file just has your basic, well, just some common configs. We implement it, and we can set a cache path to a cache. We want to enable some logging, and here's the logging. And when we, as far as this, when we actually enable the init, anything below here goes ahead and gets cached. So now come here. I'm going to wipe out the caching for us. All right, so here we go. 2715, and I'm reloading this page a couple of times. You can see that it's coming here, and I have a 10-ish second timeout. So we have 20 seconds, and I'm just continually hitting F5. So every time that I reload this, we can go ahead and see that we're still pulling the actual data from the cache itself, and instead of actually coming up and having to redynamically come up with this information every single time. So now, which I showed you that we deleted that cache, and then we can come in here, and actually if we look inside of here, we can go ahead and we can see that this more or less matches our code over here. Right, so so the package itself does some nice little stuff in there. You don't so this is an example of a full page caching, and this is nice is when you have static sites. So this caching itself is being done inside of PHP. When we're initting this, we're actually looking to see if there's this unique value that's generated from this is saved inside of the cache. And if it is, we'll go inside of the file system inside of here and we'll pull this out and we'll throw that back. And then if it's not, then we will grab this information, bring it out, and then save it into the cache for us. So I wanted to mention that this one is done inside of PHP, and you can actually have something like this check on your web server for Nginx or something like that, where you can go ahead and see it. When they're coming in, see on the Nginx configurations to see if that is configured, and then if it's not, if the cache is configured and the cache is there on the local disk, then Nginx itself will just go and grab it and pull and present that back, versus going from Nginx into PHP, booting up PHP, and then seeing if there's a cache or not. So you do get a little bit of a performance increase if you do it that way. From the Nginx side. I have a demo in PHP that I wanted to show you. So this is a pretty nice little open source package. That we were able to get up and running pretty quickly. I was happy with that. Do you guys have any questions about this or anything you'd like me to go over in a little bit more detail, or questions at all? All right. So that was the full-blown caching system, like a full page caching. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to do so now on this solution that I'm booting up right now, this is actually with Docker, and it's a Laravel 8 install, and we have Nginx and Composer, and we should also have Artisan on here as well. So then here. So I will show you the code for this one first. This one is simple. It's just a basic install, and all that I've done in here is just to add. All of the work is inside this webs file. So we have just the basic where we have just the view that we're returning, which you guys saw. We have a users section inside. I have a users URL essentially, and then from here we have a cache key that we're calling users queried, and we want to go ahead and implement that. Now within Laravel, we're going to use the cache facade, and there is a method on there that says remember. And what's really nice about this is that it actually accepts a callback. So we can set the key that we want inside of the cache and how long that we want this cache to be valid for. And then if this key is not available inside of the cache, it will actually execute this callback. And then whatever that callback is, it'll put it inside the cache for us. So that's a nice little feature. And then we have a count.
Can you zoom in a little bit?
Yep. Sweet. Is that better?
Yep.
Thank you. Right, and then we have a cache, which is essentially just we have a count, and then that's we're essentially just getting two keys from the cache, and then we have a cache to show us the cache what we have, and then to clear if we just want to clear that cache for us. So the first thing I want to show you is what we have in cache, and we have nothing, just as we expected. So now if we go into users, this is going to go ahead and grab all of the users that we have. And I just preceded this, I think, with 50. It's either 50 or 100 users inside of here. So now that we went to the users, if we're going to go back into the cache, now we can see that we have this cache inside of here. and that this is all of those users for us have been cached. So every time that we go ahead and actually access the cache, it will be there, and that cache will be there for us for another 20 seconds, right? And then 20 seconds has passed. There's a TTL essentially on or time to live, or how good a time to live on the actual record inside of the database, and then that time to live is how that data gets evicted. So once the time to live has been exceeded, what happens is on the eviction side of things, that's when we start kicking out. You can start kicking out some of the oldest stuff first, or some of the newest stuff, or the least used resource, or the least common resource. There's a bunch of different eviction policies that you can have on well. So now we'll do users again, and then now we can go back to cache, and we can just to confirm that the cache still does work, and so that we can go ahead and do count. I was testing it earlier, but you can see how many queries that we've had versus how many caches. So we're at 50 and 6. And then, so we can just come up here. I'm going to hit F5, 6. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right. So when we loaded this, we had 50 queries and 6 cache hits, and now we can see that we had 10 queries and 7 cache hits. So that just proves essentially that the caching solution is working inside of Laravel there for us. That was just a quick little demo of how we can go ahead and that's more of an object caching there for us. So this getting all the users from a database may not take that much time or computational resources, but it does everything that we have does add a load, and every time that there's another database read or network request, that's always something else in that process for us that's could potentially go wrong, or to implement issues and or slowness for us. And that was my little demo that I had from little caching 101 from the full page caching and object caching as well that we had. Do you have any questions about any of those? Anyone?
Do you have the code open source anyway?
Yeah, I'll put both of those up.
Cool.
Cool. Well, no questions that I can answer. I appreciate your feedback that you have in there, Josh. That you gave for us. So, well, I just want to say then thank you very much for everyone for allowing me to present.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Just I guess in your experience of using cache, you mentioned not using it until you really need it. When you do start tackling cache, what are some of the first things you start looking at caching? I guess, like let's say in a Laravel app, or
Sure, great question. I like to look at database hits. There's I don't know the exact amount off the top of my head, but you can go and see how many times something has been queried inside of a SQL. And I like to extract that information and then see what's being hit and what's being queried. And then seeing from that if, one, maybe I need to do something on the SQL side. Maybe I need to, implement an indexee or something like that. Or maybe that's a time to do that and implement caching. There are certain things that as you're developing the application that that's going to be a little bit more complex. And at that time, that it takes time to get it done. So in order to take that time, just save it, do the time once and just save it. So for me, I have, just as an example, one of the applications that I have, we have user roles and user permissions. And based off of your role and permission that you have your menu more or less has access, will dynamically change based off of what roles and permissions you have, right? But when you log into a system, your menus typically is going to stay the same, right? And a profile. So when you log in once, we go ahead and see if that if that's in there in the cache. If not, then let's go ahead and build that menu and then save it in the cache for us. So that way, on every single page refresh, we get that from the cache, rather than having to go out and rebuild all of that for us. Just an example.
Is there like something fairly easy, like an easy way to kind of do that, or do you really have to go through and one by one add these gets and sets? Like, I guess query caching and stuff. Is there something just out of the box you can install or things like that to make it a little easier, or is it pretty much like a by hand sort of thing?
Well, there are, by default, caching is by hand. So that's something that you have to, caching is something intentional. It's not a byproduct of something. And if your caching does become a byproduct of something else, then that means that you may not have the proper type of caching that you would like inside of there. So, to answer your questions, you do have to manually set, if you do have to say if you want to set it or if you want to get it, for the cache itself. But once you have something like that set up, then, you can go ahead and set it up as a trait or something like that, or a base class inheritance where, that can just automatically do it for you in the back end, where you don't have to think about it. And that's actually how most of my caching is I have a trait that I have a key that I have that goes off of a model, and then based off of that, it will automatically generate the cache key and everything else for me.
Oh, that's cool. That's a good idea.
Yeah. So yeah, you can either do it off of the base model, right? And then from that model, you can just extend that base model, custom model that you have, or you can just have some traits. So just two options there for you. One of the big things is how long it takes for a SQL query to perform. So however you can get that information, I always just go and look for the long SQL queries or for the long PHP processes that that are running.
Got it.
Yeah. So like one other example that I can give for caching is we have a deferred revenue application that we have that has that goes back to 2015, I believe, and there's millions of records that are inside of there, and we have to there is a lot of computation that has to go for that, because we'll break an invoice out. We don't need to go into what deferred revenue is, but essentially we have an extremely large amount of computations, and if the cache is dry when we do that, then it takes about 2 to 3 minutes or so just to go ahead and have all of those computations together just to get the data once. So then we'll just do that once and then we'll save it, so that way when we need to refresh it, and that data was only for the dashboard too. It wasn't like going down into the granular levels either. So those are great things where it takes 2, 5, 10 minutes to actually compute it. Just do it once and save it forever, or at least until you need to invalidate it.
Makes sense. Does anybody else have questions for Devin?
What's going on with your kid in the background? Like, it's like one moment he's like crying, the next moment he's like giggling and laughing. Like, it's amazing.
Yeah, I apologize for that. I didn't know I was.
No, it's fine. It's great.
Right.
Like, life.
See, I thought it was your roommate on acid.
But... No, it's not that. It's my little boy. It's bath time for him. So, we're excited for bath time, and then we're like, no, we don't want to get into the bath. And yeah, so that's life for us. I'm sure everyone else knows what that's like with kids.
Yes. Well, mine's almost 18 now, so she doesn't complain. She complains about everything, but we don't talk about bathing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm actually kind of glad that he was in here at this time, because I have a newer mic and I haven't had anyone else in the room. So I didn't know how much background noise picked up or not. So
no, it's a great talk. Yeah, cool. You could share the code and the slides. And the slides, yeah, that'd be great.
Yep, I'll do that.
Yeah, no, I was on a call earlier actually today, and I heard my kid scream like, "I don't like cucumbers," and then like a minute later, he's like, "Really, I want those cucumbers." I'm like, "Okay,
yeah, right.
Make up your mind." Yeah,
that's funny.
Sweet. All right. Well, let's switch gears over to Justin. This was I requested, but yeah, Laravel 7 and 8, and all the goodness that goes along with that.
Hopefully we can share the screen. Screen sharing failed. Oh, it's got to do the quit and come back. Sorry. New Mac.
First world problems.
Yeah, for real. I'm just wondering when our internet's going to become a utility.
I don't know, but
that depends on the election, I think.
my internet is really dodgy today.
Sorry, New Mac would have to do the security preferences. Let's play. Everyone got my screen?
Yep.
Cool.
Yes, sir.
Wonderful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about basically what changed in Laravel 7, what changed in Laravel 8, and then I'm going to talk a little bit. There's some new goodies that arrived in Laravel 8 that I'm going to talk about, specifically a project called Jetstream. So that's kind of the summary of the talk. My name is Justin Yost. I'm an engineering manager at Wirecutter. If you don't know about Wirecutter, Wirecutter is a site where we do product reviews, and we basically help you find the best stuff to live your best life. So anything from we do kids toys, we do finding the best webcams for all of the times that we're spending on Zoom, and keyboards and mice and everything else goodie for you. And yeah, that's kind of who I am and where I work and what we're going to do. So what is Laravel? If you're not familiar with Laravel, it's one of the most popular PHP frameworks out there. It's depending on how you count, is WordPress a PHP framework? Is WordPress not a PHP framework? Does Laravel count independent of Symfony? Because Laravel is built using a lot of Symfony components. It's probably the most popular, though, PHP framework that you would consider a real or a full standalone PHP framework and not an independent like CMS. It is an application that they ship a new major version every 6 months. With that, you get 6 months of active support and then 12 months of bug support. This means that it can move pretty fast. Laravel is not exactly known for sitting on the sidelines and being slow with adding new support or adding new features. Laravel is also a pretty great framework if you really want a framework that has tried to make a lot of decisions for you, and you want a framework that really tries to minimize the choices that you need to make. I think this is one of the reasons where Laravel is super popular and super easy to work with, because it is very easy to get started with. It does a lot of things to just make your life, try moving you faster along the path towards getting shipping code done. And that is one of the reasons where Laravel really excels at that core competency. Laravel 7 was released in March of 2020. If you haven't noted, if you did the math already in your head, that means this version is already out of active support. Yeah. And is now into bug support for that 12 months. So we're talking about a framework, a version of a framework that technically is no longer being actively or is receiving bug or is receiving security support, but is no longer receiving any bugs fixes anymore.
Is it still romantic versioning?
No, they did move to actual Semver. Yeah, so it is Semver. So it wound up with Laravel 7.30 or something. Like that was the final version that they wound up with, was like 7.30 or something.
Okay, because I couldn't imagine having to change all of my code every 6 months.
Yeah, it is. I think this is one of the biggest downsides with Laravel is they move way too freaking fast, and it is they. I think. Let me put it this way: Taylor, who is the founder, creator, manager, whatever you want to say of Laravel, the benevolent dictator for life for Laravel, I don't know, whatever his title is. He was like, oh, I had a project that was like 10,000 lines of code that wasn't like core Laravel. And that was like the biggest project I've ever seen. My day job has a project that's like, as we speak, is somewhere around 140,000 lines of code. And it's a Laravel project. Taylor's vision of Laravel projects is just much smaller, I think. And his vision of projects is just very small. And I think that leads to him thinking that is like very easy to like upgrade stuff. Is just like there's not a lot of customization. Like, and Laravel is kind of built that way. There's not like a good Laravel project is like you do everything in the Laravel way and you don't ever deviate from that. And you use all the Laravel's infrastructure and surrounding systems and pay for Laracast and pay for Laravel Shift and pay for everything else to like solve everything else for you and never deviate from not using anything along the Laravel way. And that is a really great choice if you are getting started in building a new web application, or you're new to PHP, or you're new to PHP frameworks in general, or you're wanting to like prototype something, or you're wanting to build a first pass around something. I don't think it is a great option for, I want to build an application that I need to run a business on for the next decade.
Well, I think he picked a target, and I think he hit the target.
Yeah.
And it performs well. And I mean, that's most of PHP, right? It's
Yeah.
a bunch of small apps where, like I've been on 100,000. I've had 100,000. Well, no, it was a 10,000 line PHP file. So
Yeah.
that I think Josh worked on too for a bit. But I mean, like stuff like that. But yeah, I think but you try to be everything for everybody. Like Symfony, I think tried to be the big thing, and then they try to like, oh, we're going to make everything so simple like Laravel. But I don't know if they ever accomplished that.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. Laravel 7, so released in March of 2020. It added one of the core things that it changed was it updated everything to be using Symfony 5 under the hood. So Laravel is a very nice wrapper around a lot of Symfony components. Laravel is built, and Laravel talks about this very openly, right? Laravel wouldn't exist without using a lot of Symfony's work. So part of Laravel 7 was really doing a lot of this work to upgrade and support Symfony 5. So if there's anything from Symfony 5 that you wanted to pull in, you now have that with Laravel 7. And it got a bunch of other features and improvements that we're going to talk through. It added this new application package, first-party API authentication package that is called Laravel Sanctum. If you looked online, or if you looked in a bunch of places when Laravel 7 was first announced, it was called Laravel Airlock. There was a trademark dispute, and so they renamed it to Laravel Sanctum. So it's Laravel Sanctum, not Laravel Airlock. But in case you see Laravel Airlock anywhere, that's where that's coming from. Laravel Sanctum is pretty much able to provide you pretty much a straightforward API authentication. So if you are building a single page application, if you're building a site where you need to provide a pretty minimal API or a straightforward API where you need to provide like tokens, or you want to provide username and password, or you want to provide some basic OAuth access where you want to be able to provide like, oh, you can use this without needing to use your username and password and such, it will totally work. However, if you need a full OAuth 2 authentication server, Laravel Sanctum does not provide that. It provides a subset of OAuth 2. This also means it's not quite as secure. So if you're needing something where you need to really consider security, it's not the right choice. That being said, it is extremely fast to get an API and to do some basic API authentication. So especially if you're building something where you're like, oh, I want to build a single page application and I need to provide a backend API, and I want to build that backend API with Laravel, and like this application is not like something really extensive or something that you don't necessarily need to consider at the highest level of security, Laravel Sanctum is the right choice for you there. Or if you're needing to provide an internal API, let's say you have, you're building a suite of internal tools for your company and you want to use Laravel. This is also probably a perfectly acceptable choice, especially if there is, other security around it. It's only accessible behind your VPN or your interweb or something along those lines. By not providing a full OAuth 2 server, what do we mean? It means there is no client credential or authorization code grant available. That client credential and authorization code grant are two things that allow a client to be authorized to act without you being actively logged into it. So it is essentially the ability for an external application to act and make requests as you without actually like you being actively logged in on a regular basis. That's basically what those credentials cover. It adds this new ZTTP HTTP client. There's a mouthful. ZTTP, it's a wrapper around Guzzle. So if you've used Guzzle before, Guzzle is a really great PHP code base or a package that gives you the ability to minimize all the differences that you need to make HTTP requests. It doesn't matter whether you're using curl. It doesn't matter whether you're using basically whatever you want. Guzzle will wind up doing that. It gives you a really nice interface to be able to access those HTTP requests, to be able to make those requests, process responses. It supports all the good PSRs. If you for some reason need to use any of the PSRs or do any of the support at that level, it's a really great standard across the board package. ZTTP is a wrapper around all of that then minimizes the API. So it doesn't support everything that Guzzle does, but it then also provides it into a Laravel facade. So if you like working with Laravel, Laravel has these things called facades. And the basic idea of a facade in Laravel is it gives you this ability to use classes and packages without necessarily really needing to do instantiation on them, needing to do a lot of extensive sorry, I'm tired. It's been a long week. Where you load the package in.
Injection?
Yeah, injection.
Yeah.
Dependency injection. Sorry, thank you. Like I said, it's been a long week, people. Yeah, it enables you to do this work without needing to necessarily instantiate or inject these classes. Which basically means that you can pretty much call into these classes without necessarily needing to do any work to like load them or lift them, right? It's just like write a line of code and you can just start using that package right away. It also, facades do also have support if you're into unit testing and supporting a bunch of mocks and everything. Facades do have the ability to swap at runtime exactly the package that is being used at runtime. And so you can swap out that facade to use a mock if you're doing some really extensive like unit testing. So this is kind of what ZTTP looks like in this way is, I mean, you can see it looks pretty much like Guzzle. It's fairly similar to the Guzzle API. So if you've used Guzzle before, ZTTP should feel pretty similar. And it's mostly just around some of the edge cases. It probably for most people, it's like 90% of the solution. It's like, yeah, somewhere around like 80 to 90% of the solution, which is like Laravel in a nutshell. It really does provide like 80% of the solution for the vast majority of cases. One of the things that I think ZTTP adds here is it reduces the workload to mock a response. So I think this is extremely useful. If you have in your application where you're needing to mock responses back, you're needing to say, hey, I need to call out to some API. Say like, in this case, we're saying that we're talking to GitHub's API. I want to be able to quickly mock out a response for that API. So that way I don't hit the real GitHub API. And that way I can test against what I expect that API to return. ZTTP makes this super easy to just mock out those responses in your tests. First party core solution. For the longest time, Laravel had an external package that everyone used to provide core support, they went ahead and just pulled that package into Laravel and made everyone's life so much better, and didn't force a bunch of people to get burned by realizing that, oh, we should really do cores and then spend a bunch of time trying to configure it and get everything just perfectly right. Speaking as someone who had to do this cores work and get it all perfectly right and kosher and make sure everything was working perfectly, this was an extremely awesome change, because this made my life so much easier, because getting cores exactly right with the old package was a little bit finicky on occasion, and they just made my life so much easier, and I really appreciate that. Fluent string operations. So they added this new ability to have fluent string operations. So you have this package, the stir package, and you can see we call stir of, we pass in a string. So this now has turned that into an actual string object that Laravel can operate on in these, and just pass in these operations back to it. So you can call trim on it. You can call, say, cut off only the last two words, and make it, and after those two words, or sorry, not cut off the last two words, only display two words, and then after that do the 3 periods for the ellipse, and then convert everything to uppercase, and we'll get back, this is, and it will just return a string. It won't return this weird string object that it's using internally. Just like when that fluent string operation is done, it'll just return that raw string itself. So again, a little bit nice, especially if you do some of these operations and work with some of this stuff. Just made it a little bit nicer. This is probably one of the bigger things if you are doing some of the more complex pieces in Laravel, especially if you're building some of the single page applications. This also goes to the work I mentioned, Jetstream, that we're going to talk about in a little bit later. This is really laying some of the foundations for the work that they did in Jetstream. So this provides the ability for you to have custom class-based Blade components. So what exactly does that all mean? So Blade is Laravel's rendering template layer. A component in Blade is essentially a custom. It's an include. You're able to include a little bit of code and add, this other little template. So you can have something like a navigation, or you can have a title, or whatever else you want, right? Components are just like these pieces, right? You typically start with an overall big template, and typically your template then is made up of a bunch of components that are pulling in data and information and then organizing that. So that way you don't need to repeat all that logic everywhere or necessarily duplicate stuff. This class-based Blade component gives you the ability to use class-based rendering logic layer in Laravel. So what does that look like? So it uses this little X dash syntax. So your component winds up having this X dash nav, and in this case, then title. That title then gets passed to the class itself as a public property. That public property can then be modified and pass along that data, or pull in new data to that Blade template. And then you render out a different Blade template that actually then displays that final component. So like in your Blade template, you would have this component file that says x-nav. That calls a class that's like nav blade component or something along those lines, or like nav component. I can't remember the exact way it's worded. That passes in a property to that class title, in this case, update your info. There's a render method in there that you can then tell exactly which Blade template you want to render, along with passing any additional data back into that new Blade template that will render. So then you can modify and pass along new data. So this gives you the great ability to be able to say something like, let's say I need in this case, I have this navigation bar, and I want to be able to determine whether I'm logged in or logged out. And maybe I have a bunch of complications around determining whether I'm logged in or logged out. So I really don't want to do that in my rendering logic. I don't want to do that in my view layer. I really want to have a class or a model method or something along those lines. Like I want to have some sort of PHP code that is doing that logic. In this case, I would call that navigation component that navigation component would go to PHP, and the Laravel layer would then pick up. I would then be able to use all my Laravel goodness to understand whether or not I'm logged in, logged out, exactly what state, what navigation options I want to pass along, and maybe even modify or merge data in any particular way that I want to, and then render an actual final blade template. Custom stubs for Artisan Make, another thing that made my life a lot better. So you have this thing in Laravel where you have Artisan Make. Artisan Make gives you the ability to essentially make standard, somewhat formulaic versions of common classes. So I want to make a new model. I want to make a new migration. I want to make a new CLI command. I want to make a new controller. I want to make a new, for whatever reason they decided not to cover every single make template or stub, but they did do most of them. Multiple mail drivers. I don't know that this is necessarily super nice, but it can be nice. It's the same as multiple database drivers or any other thing. You now have multiple ways to send out an email. So maybe you use Postmark for your transactional emails, and you use MailChimp for your regular marketing emails. So someone signs up and they join, let's say they buy something from your site. You can call mailer, say which mailer you're accessing, in this case, Postmark, and then send your email. In this case, we're going to send a transaction email. But then we can also, just in that same thing, say, I want to also call the mail library, and this time I want to talk to the mailer for MailChimp, and I want to send my welcome email through MailChimp. Nice, simple, not super complicated. But yeah, just a little nicety. Routing improvements. This was a really big thing, I think. Routing when cached is up to 2 times faster than Laravel 6. That is really nice because routing, in many cases, especially if you're doing some really custom stuff with your routing, can be pretty slow in Laravel in certain occasions, especially if you weren't having it cached. But then even when you did have it cached, sometimes depending on what you were doing, it could be particularly slow. So they really improved it here. You can also now model bind to custom fields. So what this means is, in this case, Laravel has this cool little feature called model binding, where you can bind a route and say that this value passed in here is equivalent to, normally you would say just the user.id, right? So in your database table, user, that ID. So if you go to users/1234, it automatically looks up and finds the user with the ID of 1234. You can now bind that to a custom field. So if you want to have a user/slug, or you could have user/user username, for instance, or you could imagine that for blogs of blogs/blog post or something along those lines. And you can see here, in this case, I get the user right out of the box, and now I have the user that I can manage with. Custom eloquent cast at query time. So this adds the ability for you to do this with cast method on your eloquent queries. Eloquent is Laravel's ORM layer. So you can cast a field to a custom Laravel type when you run a query. This is kind of the example that they provide. I'm selecting user, I'm selecting all the user fields, and then I'm also getting this last posted at field. And this last posted at field is, I'm selecting the created at field for post for user. So this is a fake model that I'm envisioning just making up on the spot, in which we find a post for a user, and we're selecting the first one that was created out, or the last one, or whatever. And in this case, that last posted at field, because of how this operated, that field wouldn't necessarily, because it's a new field that Eloquent doesn't actually understand what that field is. In this case, I can cast it and I can say, okay, I want you to treat that field as if it was a date. You can treat fields as date times, JSON objects, anything that you can essentially, any of the Laravel types that Eloquent gives you to enable you to have a database type as, you can cast it to that. And so in that case, that last posted at field would be casted as a date. That's kind of Laravel 7. Laravel 8 was released in September of 2020. So I don't know if anyone knows, but we're now in November, shockingly. So yeah, we're already about halfway through Laravel 8's release cycle at this point, right? September to October, October to November, or well, we're a third of the way through Laravel 8's release cycle at this point, and they're on somewhere like Laravel 8.13ish or something, I think. So moves fast. Model changes. It added a app model namespace. This is optional. You don't have to use this, but in former versions of Laravel, many times people's models would just live under the app namespace. And so you would open up the app directory and you would see a big list of, here's a bunch of direct other subfolders with controllers and HTTP and routing and all kinds of other stuff. And then you would have this big long list of files of user and post and money and whatever else. Now there's a model namespace. So if you want to organize your models into an actual model namespace, you can do so. Again, totally optional, and it's fairly easy to update and change if you have an existing project that you're moving to this, but it's there. Model factories are now class-based. The big change that occurred with this, if you've used model factories in the past and you didn't do anything really complicated or fancy with your factories, probably nothing much has changed for you in this case. However, the big thing is you can do what is called a state transformation on a factory. So, for instance, something might be a state transformation for a post. So a post, just a generic blog post, may be published or unpublished, and that may be a state transformation. Like you want to be able to say, oh, I need to create 10 published blog posts versus I want to be able to quickly create 10 unpublished blog posts. That's a state. And you can do a transformation on the factory to say, I want the factory to produce records that have this kind of state information about them. Instead, with these model factories now being class-based, you can do that actually in a function on the factory. That makes it much, much easier to do these state transformations. I have several factories in my project at work that do these state transformations, and they will look much simpler whenever we get a chance to upgrade to Laravel 8. Migration squashing. If you have any projects in which you run a lot of database migrations on it, it probably has a 50 gazillion migration files, especially if you accidentally made a mistake and you're like, oh, shoot, I did that as post ID, but I left it signed and really it should be unsigned because that was dumb. And now you have 2 migrations when really you wish you only had 1. You can squash all the migrations down to a single schema file, and then it will essentially delete all of those other migrations. And then when you run the migration in the future, or you run your migrations in the future, it will run the schema and it will say, here's that state of the schema. And then it will run any new migration. So you can still add new migrations. It's not like, oh, you have to do the schema thing only. Instead, it is just you collapse all your migrations down and discard them, except for a single schema file that says, here's the schema of the database at this point in time. And then you can add new migrations on top of that. So it's as if you're giving your database a fresh start, or at least your migrations listing a fresh start. Job batching. So job batching is incredibly useful, and again, something that I'm gonna love to use. It gives you the ability to do this thing where you can batch up jobs. Okay, so what do I mean? So you have this bus that you create. Notice it's another facade. That bus has a thing called batch. It takes a series of jobs. So in this case, I'm saying process podcast. That process podcast is a job that I want to run. This bus batch then batches up those jobs and tells those jobs to run. You then have some, following standard PHP kind of logic. You have a then, a catch, and a finally, and a dispatch. Your then is a callback that occurs if all the jobs completed successfully. The catch is if any job failed in that batch. And then finally, when the batch has finished executing, regardless of the success or failure of the total batch. And then dispatch just tells that batch to be executed. So it then ships those jobs off to be run. And then those callbacks are there that you can write any code to handle any possible things that you want to have occur on, the different success or failure modes. That batch then has its own, it has its own little sub logic in it. And it'll get recorded in the jobs table and all this sort of stuff, where it'll even say, here's the number of jobs, here's what those jobs were, and that sort of thing. This is useful if you do this sort of work where rather than creating, 100 different jobs, instead what you really want to create is a batch. You just want to create one batch and say, here's the 100 jobs that I need to have run. So that can be nice and useful. Rate limiting. If you've used rate limiting before in Laravel, it was pretty limited. Not to use the pun, but yeah, it was pretty limited. The rate limiting was basically along the lines of, okay, limit by IP address or by session, essentially, and limit, you can only have this number of requests in this amount of time, which is fine and certainly acceptable, but not if you want a real rate limiting system where you want to, for instance, you want to be able to say, if you're a paid user, your rate limit is way higher. If you want to be able to have the rate limiting system scale up and scale down depending on certain circumstances, let's say at midnight, you're like, well, no one's on the site, so I don't care if someone hits, the rate limit can be twice as high at that point. Or you have something where you say, hey, I know it's going to be a very big, it's going to be a super busy period of time during this period of time. So do we want to have the rate limit higher, or do we want to have the rate limit lower during that period of time? And we want to actually write code to dynamically support that. Or maybe you have the ability to say, hey, I want to be able to tell how full my cache is. And I have the ability to query my cache, and I say hey, when the cache is really full, I'm fine with the rate limit being higher, or whatever that is. But now there is a real rate limiting system in which you can actually do and make those sorts of choices, rather than simply saying oh no, you only get 60 requests in a minute or whatever, which was the old rate limiting system. Maintenance mode. Maintenance mode was slightly changed. It did two big things that I think are actually really solid improvements. You can now pass just a token. There's none of this goofy IP address. You have to list, here's all the IP addresses that can bypass maintenance mode, which was a real hassle, especially, we're all working from home. Our IP addresses are not our offices in wherever. And so now you can just pass in a token. You can also, this was incredibly nice if you did deployments in such a way that you ran Composer in production, which, okay, maybe you shouldn't do that, or sometimes we run Composer in production, where you can set an error page to render before Laravel is even available. So while Composer or your application is still booting up and still installing all the various packages, or while something is occurring that means Laravel is not able to actually operate, you essentially pre-render and pre-cache an error page. And so you say, I'm going to render, in this case, it renders the errors 503 page. If you've worked with Laravel, you'll understand kind of you'll know exactly how that would be worded and exactly which file that would be wording to, what would be pointing to. But it'll render that 503 page, even if everything else isn't available, more or less. And then you have this little token or secret, and you just pass that in. You don't have to use it. It's not a query param. It's not anything. You just pass it on to the end of the URL, and you'll be able to view the page even if even while maintenance mode is turned on. Time testing improvements. You can travel through time, which I'm sure many of us would love to be able to travel through time sometimes. In this case, you have this little function of this travel. So you say, I want to travel, and then you pass in the actual minutes, hours, days, weeks, seconds, etc. And whenever you call then now will actually return that we're 5 minutes in the future. You can also do this slightly differently, where you can say this travel to, and then you can say now minus, some number of hours, or now add hours or add days or whatever. And it'll return, your application will envision as itself is now at that point in time. This is great if you're wanting to do things like you want to do a test where you want to be like, hey, I want to create a bunch of users in the past, and then I want to jump forward 5 hours, and I want to see if any of those users show up when I search for users created between the last hour and the last 4 hours. And none of those users should show up, even though you just created those users. I don't know. That's a gimmicky example, but it's useful. And then if you just want to reset everything, they give you this nice little travel back function. So you call travel back, and you're now back into the present. Queue jobs. So we talked a little bit about batch jobs here. The other job improvement here is there's now the ability to provide an exponential back off of queue jobs. So a queue job is a job that I'm not executing right away, and instead I've batched up that job, and that job is sitting in my queue, wherever that queue is. Sometimes it's Redis, sometimes it's just a standard database, sometimes it's something else. It's sitting there in that queue waiting to be executed. And let's say I try that job and something fails. Let's say it's trying to talk to an API, and the API is sometimes flaky. Well, we could try it again in just like another minute. But maybe we know, like, look, if this API sometimes just goes down and we want it to have an exponential back off, or maybe this job is really big and we know it takes a really long period of time. So we're checking in on it. We don't want to check on it just like every single minute. Instead, we want to kind of have this exponential back off. So we can try it every minute. And then we'll back off and we'll say, okay, try it in 2 minutes. And then we'll say, okay, it failed. Try again in 5 minutes. Okay, try again in 10 minutes. Okay, try again in 30 minutes. And it gives you that ability to kind of build that in. Laravel Jetstream. Laravel Jetstream is a new application scaffold for Laravel. So I think one of the things that Laravel really does quite well is it provides you a lot of really great scaffolding. The basic features for an application. If you've used the Laravel auth scaffolding in the past, this replaces that wholesale. It provides login, registration, email verification system, a two-factor auth system, session management, API and team management. That API management, that is through, or was it? Laravel Sanctum. So Laravel Sanctum is being used here. Login, registration, email verification are all kind of pretty standard. And session management is also pretty standard. Team management is a little bit new. This scaffolding also uses Tailwind for CSS. So Tailwind is a utility CSS library. It then uses Livewire or inertia.js for front-end rendering. So it is kind of designed to operate as a single page application style application. That Livewire and inertia.js is also then using much more of those custom class-based components to then build in a lot of the logic and provide for that single page application and provide for the wiring between your front end to your back end API. However, there is a big caveat with this. Laravel Jetstream is not designed, unlike the old Laravel auth scaffolding, where you could add that in after the fact. Like you could start building an application, then add in the Laravel auth scaffolding after the fact that you started your application. You could have spent years on your application and then be like, oh, I finally need authentication for whatever reason. You could add that Laravel auth scaffolding in years after you started your application. Laravel Jetstream is designed for, this is a brand new project that you are starting from scratch. It is not really designed around the ability for you to add this in and say, hey, I want to use this new thing, or I want to migrate a project to use Laravel Jetstream. You need to start from scratch if you're using Laravel Jetstream. But if you're really into like wanting to build a pretty, you know, an application, especially if you're really interested in like some of the single page application sort of stuff, Laravel Jetstream is really great for this. And again, it provides you, login, registration, email all that stuff just like out of the box without you having to do anything. Unfortunately, yeah, you can't really get all that. Like that stuff is all existing in Laravel out of the box, but you have to like plug in all the different things and write the code and the front end and everything else along that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's super nice if you're really interested in like building a single page application, or you want to see how far you can get with like a basic Laravel app, and you want to build something, as fast as possible if you're prototyping. That's kind of the talk. There's my Twitter. I spend too much time on Twitter. I'm on GitHub, but I'm an EM. I'm an engineering manager now. I'm not on GitHub anymore. What are you talking about? And that's my personal site. I do videos much like this for Linda or LinkedIn Learning. You can go there and you can watch videos of me talking about Laravel. And if you watch those videos, I make money. And I like money. Don't we all?
Nice. I have a couple of questions.
Sure, Josh.
So I'm sure I could easily look this up, but what's Laravel's strategy on LTSs for like versions?
They do have LTSs. Their LTSs are, I can look up exactly what it is, but their LTSs are supported for like 2 years, I think, 2 to 3 years, something like that.
And is it like every other version or something that they
It's
use?
like, no, it's every 4 versions. Yeah. So it's every 2 years the LTSs are supported, and then they're provided. Yeah, I think it's bug support for 2 years and security support for 3 years. And they're updated every 4 versions. So I think Laravel 5 was their LTS. So then 9 would be the next LTS, and 5 then would lose bug support here in like 4-ish months, and it would lose security support in about 16 months from now.
Got it. The with cast thing was interesting. I recently seen that in one of the projects I work on, and it was like, what is this? And so that kind of answers that. I never dug into it, but when you pulled that up, I was like, oh, that's what that is.
It's pretty cool. I mean, I do find that useful, right? Like, especially if you are kind of accessing these, or you're wanting to mod like that last created time, right? Like it's a date time field, but really I want to treat it as a date on the front end. Like I never want to deal with it as a time value, or don't care about the time value on the front end. I do want that time value recorded and stored, but like I only want to treat this field as a date. Like you could do that before with some of the uh setters and getters, where you could, have the getter just modify it and say like, discard the time or whatever, or like, convert it or cast it or whatever. But instead the with cast makes it just like built into the query now.
Yeah, that's they at one point, I guess some developer thought that migrations were bad, so they added a table that is called entity attributes, and that is what that with cast thing is doing. Essentially, anytime they want to just add a willy-nilly column to a table, they're using this other table to track. It's a mess. Like, yeah, but
That is an interesting approach.
yeah, I don't think that developers around anymore, probably for maybe some of those reasons. But on the subject of facades, which I know is touchy, right? The purists are always like, I work with a company right now actually that they're so against facades. They're like, no more using facades. You have to dependency inject. But then I see some things in facades that are just like, wow, that is really cool. Like the ZTTP thing that you were showing, especially how you can like fake responses and stuff. That's like super useful, right? And yeah, there's probably ways you can do it with just Guzzle, like in a test and things like that. But when, and I'm full of stupid questions, but one question I have is like, is it possible to, and maybe it's not, like dependency inject facade? Like,
Yeah, you can totally. Facades are not required. Like they're not. You don't have to use a facade to get much of the facade goodness if you don't want to. So you can dependency inject a facade. And in fact, the project I work on at work, like we actually very rarely use facades just like straight up, right? Very often we do use facade like and dependency inject them in. And Laravel, I think Laravel makes this even easier because if you on your construct method in your classes, you can just tell it all the classes you want. You can just say, I want this class. And as long as Laravel understands the class hierarchy or like where that class exists and what that class is, and it's a class inside of Laravel's namespace, not a Laravel thing, but it is either in your application in Laravel or it is a thing inside of Laravel's, framework. So it's either like a core thing that you wrote that follows a Laravel pattern style approach, or it is a Laravel, class itself. In that construct, you can just say, hey, I want that class, I want that class, I want that class, and bring it all in, right? And then at runtime, if you ever need to, for your testing layer, when you construct, you can just pass in your fake, your mock, your whatever that you need, your stub. And you have now achieved dependency injection and gained all the benefits of having a facade if you want to use it like and treat it as and like everywhere else in your class you can treat it as if it was a facade and it literally makes no difference.
and I gotta look more into that because, yeah, I mean, I understand like it does auto wire, like if I put a logger interface, for example, but I don't know if it would work if I did facade log or whatever.
It will.
It would? Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and you can modify it. So like one of the benefits, so they have changed this about facades. I think they've gotten the religion at least about that they need to make it possible that like so at runtime you can change what that facade is pointing to. So you can do that either for your tests or you can also do that for your own application. Like if you want to say, oh, I don't like Laravel's logger because it does something weird. As long as you meet, the logger interface, you can swap out what that logger is pointing to at runtime. And you can swap in your own logger. So you can do that just as easily for your tests. And you can say, hey, I want this facade to be used at runtime.
Yeah,
Or I want this class to be used at runtime for, this named facade.
right. Yeah. And I know that PHP unit does have some support for facades for doing some things like that. But like, I think, especially with this particular team, they just hate using static methods, right? And for good reason. But yeah, so that's interesting.
I mean, that's where I would say, right? So like that's where I would say then you can still do the dependency injection where you can inject that on that construct method. And you can inject like the class that the facade is pointing to because all the facade does. So the facade does two things. One, it provides that static wrapper around that. So you don't have to do any of that sort of like instantiating the class or any of that other fun stuff, right? That's like one of the big things that you get with the facade. All those facades do point to real classes that have real methods that don't have to use that static interface. So you can just inject that on the constructor, gain all the benefits of using that core underlying class and not, still not have to do any real instantiation of the class, still have the ability to do dependency injection if you need to, and gain all the benefits and the access of having like this class that has all the Laravel niceties of like, hey, I can just like use the class right away and like no, you won't be able to use it statically, but you will be able to just like you can call the class and now it is a property of your, when you construct that class, you now have it as a property on your class. and then you can call this logger arrow, info, whatever, and you're done.
Yeah. Then the last was more of a note, but Laravel Jetstream seems freaking amazing because, like, how many times have you go and you want to spin up kind of like a boilerplate thing, and there's a lot of like third-party things out there of different ways that people have done it, but nothing like where it's been led by the community like that. And I've heard a lot about Livewire. I think even Devin did a talk about it, or someone did a while back. And Tailwind, I hear a lot about that. So that's definitely something I want to take a look at and experiment a little bit with, just because that sounds cool.
It's very cool. It's very pretty. I mean, I don't think I'm particularly going to use it because like I'm not building many like brand from scratch Laravel projects per se. And also I'm not a big fan of single page applications. But that being said, like it is very cool. And especially if it is like, hey, I want to build a prototype and I want to like spend 20 minutes on building out the authentication stuff. Sign up for Jetstream then, because it is done in 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's a good selling point for sure.
Hey, Justin, I just wanted to add, have you looked into Fortified at all?
Sorry, Fortified?
I'm sorry, Fortify, Laravel Fortify.
Fortified. No, I have not.
Okay, so that's actually that's what powers, that's the back end to Jetstream. So you can actually,
okay, cool.
So you can install that, and it gives you all the backend capabilities. So you can just write your own front end, whether in Blade or in Vue. So that way you can integrate that into your own system.
Oh, that's super cool. I didn't know that. Thank you so much for mentioning that. That is super cool.
Yeah. So then you can actually and then what's really nice about it is that I haven't implemented it myself, but I started looking into it. But the configuration is apparently supposed to be more like from the service providers. So you can just turn things on and off, like two-factor authentication, some of the other settings essentially. And then
I did really like that about Jetstream, is it is very much, it feels very pluggable. Like clearly they have designed it with the idea that like, hey, we want to be able to like plug in a different service provider, as you said, as different service provider for whatever sort of option, like, and make that pluggable. And like, that's clearly like a direction that they want to go. And that's very cool.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because that Fortify also, you can have your own, custom adapters as well. So
that's super cool. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense because they did make it super easy. It's just like whenever you do like Laravel, you do artist or Laravel new, Jetstream or a init Jetstream or something like that, and then you just like have an option that says, you just pass in and say like, do I want to do inertia? Do I want to do Livewire? And it's very obvious that it's like in the future, it's like, do you want to use, I don't know, whatever, Ember? Do you want to use, I don't know, Angular for like you're super old or something?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
That's cool. Justin, I was gonna have a question. You laughed at when you said that you haven't upgraded to Laravel 8 yet, and I'm kind of in the same boat as well with the upgrade pain per se. So I was just wondering, how do you manage and maintain that?
Honestly, we're going to start paying for Laravel Shift is what we're going to do, because it's for the nice plan. It is. So what is Laravel Shift? Laravel Shift is a service that you can pay for, and they essentially do a lot of the work in automating, upgrading your projects. And we did a test run of it, of like doing we did some free shifts, and we've also done one of the we paid for just like the Laravel 7 to Laravel 8 shift, just like out of the box, to see what it would do and whatnot. And it's still our code based, it still require a fair bit of changes, but the workload and the time reduced was pretty substantial for us to then, take that and move forward. So Laravel Shift, it's like it's either 10 or $20 a month if you want the full whole package. And you can run as many projects as you want, basically, more or less. and it'll essentially automate doing a lot of this sort of stuff of like, hey, I will have a Laravel 4 project, and I need to upgrade it to Laravel 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, and so on and so forth, along with a bunch of other stuff, including stuff like we ran it to do the model namespace moving around. Like that's the free shift that we ran on that. And honestly, that is probably the option that we're going to go with, just because like the people hours to do that work, like the people hours for us to take our project from Laravel, one of the versions of 5.4 ish or so, to Laravel 7 was, on the order of like 7 months. Like it was 7 or 8 months that we spent doing that, of people hours. Like, is just a massive time investment. And it just like, I mean, we're estimating, like we did the estimate of like what would it take for us to take our project from 7 to 8, not using Laravel shift, and it was like probably a month of some engineer's time. Like, and that is just like unacceptable. Like, we just can't, like, we're not doing that.
No, definitely. I know exactly what you mean. I'm kind of in the same boat myself, right? Because I mean, you don't want to be, having an engineer. You want the engineer moving the company forward rather than maintaining the company. So when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, I agree with you. I think that shift is pretty affordable, and you get a lot of bang for your buck. Before. Cool. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep. But yeah, that's what we're going to do, is we're going to just fork over, $120 every 6 months and call it done.
For the price, that's not bad. I'm really surprised there's no open source version of Laravel Shift. I've always wondered about that because there have been Laravel projects I've needed to update, and I've looked at Laravel Shift, and the developer I had working on it was like, "Oh, we can do it ourselves. It's not that bad." But we didn't bump up the version that much. But I imagine with some of these harder upgrades, it's totally worth it.
And it one of the big things is, like, as you upgrade, I think one of the things that does get harder is the docs don't get updated, right? So like there's no backporting of docs, and like one of the things you start missing out on is like, hey, if you haven't moved over like your configuration files, or if you haven't moved this over or that over, the documentation is now out of date for like where stuff lives or how stuff is kind of slightly organized and such. And that's one of the things where it's not as simple or as straightforward as just like, oh, here's the breaking changes that you need to fix. Oh, we changed the name of this function to this other function name, right? Like it is more complex than that. And you have to like move around files. You have to update how those files are laid out and look and such. And that becomes a much more complex operation, right? And if you want to do that well, and you want to try having a coherent thought to like, oh, now I can look at the documentation and this feels like a modern Laravel application, that's a piece that you really need to do that work in. And that is not just as simple as just like reading the upgrade guide and doing that work, right? It is, you have to do further than just looking at that upgrade guide. Like, and I think that's a piece, like doing the upgrade guide, especially for smaller projects, like really is true for them, that it is in general like less than a day for doing the upgrades. Like, if you have a small enough project, like most of the upgrades really are pretty small and minimal. The big thing is like, oh, here's all these pieces that we moved around in the project. And now, creating a new Laravel project will look totally different from how your Laravel project is. And then if you're trying to onboard someone who's an experienced Laravel dev, or a contractor or whatever else, they're going to look at it and they're going to be like, wait, I don't understand. Where's your routing? Like, why don't you have your routes split up into a web API, and whatever else? And you're like, no, we just have the routes.php file. Isn't that good enough? And it's like, no, I don't understand. Like, I don't get how this routes.php file is supposed to work, because that was discarded like 3 years ago.
Yeah, I was trying to convince. There's a code base I'm working on that has closures everywhere for the routes, and I'm like, we got to use route caching, and you can't use route caching when you have closures.
You can now.
Oh, okay. Is that a new feature?
Laravel 7.
Oh.
That was one of the little bits that I skipped over it, like I didn't mention it because I don't really use closures because I don't like closures for routes for the obvious reason that you couldn't cache them before. But now in Laravel 7 you can cache them.
That might be a really good reason for them to move to that then. I'll be sure to mention that. Cool. Awesome. Does anybody else have questions for Justin? All right. Great talk, Justin. As always, both talks were amazing.
Thanks, Justin.
Sweet. So let's move on to prizes, and then we'll open the floor for topics next month and all the other fun stuff. So if you want to be included for the chance to win, can you drop your name in the chat here? If you click on the bottom left button and just type your name in, I will put you on the wheel of names here and include you. Alrighty. All right. Last call. If you want to get a chance to win PHP Storm license or a SymphonyCast membership, drop your name in the chat. Or if chat's not working for some reason, just holler. Adam, is JetBrains sponsoring the Python group? You're still running that, right?
Yeah, I mean, actually, we probably could get them to sponsor it again. They apparently haven't asked you how many members show up lately, because we got dropped because our membership was too low.
Weird. I bet you if you try again, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
Just like you total members, because I thought you're
No, it's a number. They had a thing that's at least 30 people showing up per meetup.
Okay.
For them
Yeah,
to sponsor it.
they definitely don't check that. I mean, well, maybe they do, but
Well, they would just ask. They used to have when you asked for it, they'd ask you how many members showed up, right?
right, yeah, they don't do that anymore. Then for my yeah, no. So I don't know. I've anytime I've not gotten the email, I just reached out to them, and they're pretty good about renewing it. But who knows? Maybe they're selling more PyCharm licenses, and they're a little tighter on those. But
no, it used to be. It was the same thing. Like that was part of the requirements for getting them to sponsor you, is that you had an average of 30 people attending. And when I was doing it with PHP, I used to have to fill out go to a web. You go to URL, fill it out, and they would ask you how many attendees.
yeah.
And on the Python one, it just for a while there, it was down to like I don't know 6 or 7. Then it caught back up. So
Yeah, no, Python's on fire right now.
I don't know if it's on fire. There's probably 20, 30 people.
Yeah, doing good. I heard there was on a podcast I was listening to, there's some drama going on in the Python community. It sounded like.
There's always some Python. There's always some drama going on in every community.
yeah. No, I feel you. But PHP has just been quiet lately. I think it's more what it is.
Well, you've got the PHP 8 forever people now.
Yeah. There's some good people on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the Fig basically just kind of petered out.
Fig's not a thing anymore.
It's a thing, but like none of the I don't know that really any of the Laravel pulled out. There is no WordPress really isn't involved in it. They didn't do anything about it. So you take the top 2 kind of packages in all of PHP, and they just pull out. It's not doesn't really help. And what work is there left to do? To be perfectly honest.
Yeah, well, without WordPress on board, I can see how. And I think I remember Fabian being kind of like tough with them. So
yeah.
Well, yeah, you know, you can't win.
Yeah, I
them
mean,
all.
once you got a log interface, you got an injector interface. Like it did a lot, right? At the
Yeah.
time, it really did a lot. Like there was no standard way to log. There was no standard for an HTTP request. Although most people, I hate the fact that the HTTP request is immutable. Like it was fairly controversial, but like, I don't see them doing a whole lot more work, just to be honest. Like, I mean, they've been trying to do the proof of or the code of conduct, but I don't think that ever really went anywhere. But I don't think there's anything really active right now. I'm on the mailing list. Like I don't get much.
Yeah, yeah. That's I'm sure. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe it might get kicked back up eventually.
But for what? Like what are they going to what are they going to create a standard for?
Yeah, it's true. They already got all the big things, right? Maybe it's more fleshing out. Um, I don't know. Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, I don't know if there's much other than if they start over standardizing things. I can see that being a problem
Right.
too. Yeah. So
There's nothing really emerging in the space. So like you don't need an emerging standard because there's nothing really emerging. Like it's a lot of why Laravel uses Symfony, right? It's a lot of why you have 5 or 6 different things based off of Symfony, because they're kind of interchangeable parts. So you can use Slim plus something else, a piece of middleware in there, but it'll work because Slim just works on middleware and it uses the standards, so everything's good. So I think it was helpful, and I think it did a lot of heavy lifting really, really early on, and then it's I've never hear about meetings. I'm sure they meet, but like at the big conferences, I haven't seen them meet. I mean, there's been a conference for a year, but or 6 months or whatever it is now. But yeah, I don't know if there's a whole lot going on.
yeah. Have you? Let me hold on. Let me before I continue the conversation. Let me just make sure I get the prizes out of the way. So Chris, he took the PHP Storm license, and then Alex, are you cool with the Symphony Cast membership, or do you want to pass that along? He'll take it. Okay.
Great.
Congratulations, guys. Yeah, well, what I was going to ask, and then we'll move on to topics, is are there about conferences? Because I imagine if there are, they're all remote at this point. I wonder, have you looked at the CFP site or anything like that? Are there any out there that are worth submitting to?
On the PHP side, I don't really know. Like ZenCon is dead, and All for One, they all got jobs, which was the what was it? I'm trying to remember. I don't know which one of their t-shirts on, but yeah, they're the ones that did. Last one was in Atlanta. PHP World and PHP Tech. So they've all and they did some other conferences, and they're all just kind of got other jobs because they're not making any money. So yeah, I don't know. I know that the one in what's the one that's in Canada? That was still going on. It was remote. I spoke there one year. I don't remember the name of it.
Something web, wasn't it? Yeah,
yeah. So it was like multi-language.
Yeah. Do you, off the top of your head, remember that CFP site that Uncle Cal built that has a list of upcoming CFPs? Maybe I'll reach out to him about that.
Yeah, I don't. I know that. Yeah, I know there's a CFP site that's written in PHP. I don't remember what it is. If you go check the, I know there actually were there was a CFP I saw. I think it might have been for Europe, but it's all remote anyway now. In the PHP Slack channel, PHP UG Slack channel, there's a CFP room or whatever they are for Slack.
Yeah, I'm in that, but not in that channel. Yeah, I'll take a look at that. Cool. So topics for next month. I know we're going into December, so it's going to be kind of quiet. Last year, I think we might even skip December. But Does anybody have any topics they'd like to hear about or want to speak about? I'll take that as a no. This is always the hard part. Yeah, well, we'll tentatively plan for a meetup. Maybe we might, if anything, I can do one of my talks that I recently gave about Easy Engine and Terraform, using like basically some scripts I open source to quickly spin up an instance, and it installs all the WordPress things on the box for you. But I'm going to try to see if we can get another topic out there. Really, I know it's not PHP related, but definitely like a React talk would be cool. I'm not sure if there's like a JS or a React meetup here locally, but I know the web developers one is pretty big. But I'll reach out and see if we can get someone to speak about that, because as Justin said, I try to, I'm like just trying to like push off as much as possible learning React, but it's going to be inevitable that I have to. So something I definitely want to get on my radar eventually, and I'm sure others do.
I became a manager rather than learning React.
That's a good way to dodge it. Yeah. I don't know.
I moved into product.
Yeah, I would like to meet up next week. I mean, not next week. I'm sorry, next week, if possible. That would be cool. If no one else is, gonna throw anything out there, I can. There's Livewire 2.0 that's out now. A lot has changed since because when I did my last one, it was still in beta technically. You can do that.
Cool one.
Just I know Justin likes Livewire as well.
Yeah, I'd love to see that one.
Okay, I can throw something together for that.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, I'll jockey some other people, see if I can get a React talk put together by somebody who knows what they're talking about. But yeah, I think other than that, let me just stop the recording here.